It's not that today marks a particularly significant day. In fact, it's a typically grey day in Huddersfield, isn't it? And it's not as if... Sorry? You don't have it? No, I'm sure. And it's not as if, I hope you don't mind me saying this, that the sort of the great and the good are flocking together to celebrate a great leap forward in policy and momentum. All that happened on Monday up in Glasgow as the big cities had their winged in. Or that somehow we're sending out some clear political message ahead of the general election, as the Tories have been trying to do in northern cities every Friday, I think, over the past few weeks. No, I think today is more of an edgy event than that. It's more like the Stone Roses on Spike Island than One Direction at the O2 Arena. It's the kind of event where 20 years from now, I think many people will claim to have been here. Today's event brings together different voices and different interests. Today's event brings together people who are looking past our present politics for something new and something better. People for whom the idea of constitutional change is not just a necessary evil to be included in the next political programme, but something to be brought to life by reimagining the kind of state and society in which we all want to live. Today's event brings together people who are reinventing politics from the bottom up. And so I want to start by paying tribute to a few of those people who, if you like, have already put their heads above the parapet in the name of a new politics in the north. People like Andy Mycock and Ariana, who have been writing about this sense of growing northern political identity and who have convened today's symposium. People like Hilton Dawson and colleagues who have set out a manifesto for the North East in the name of the North East Party. People like Richard Carter and Stuart Arnold, who've put historical party political differences to one side to form Yorkshire First as an altogether different kind of political party. People like Harold Ellertson and Michael Dawson, who've dared to dream of a pan-northern approach to subnational governance. And of course, the inspirational Paul Salverson, who mixes being a regional transport geek with championing the Hannah Mitchell Foundation and now standing as a Yorkshire First candidate in the Colne Valley. You are the voices of new politics in the north that 20 years from now, I think we'll all have to thank for sowing the seeds of lasting change. Now, none of this is to say that I agree with everything that these people stand for. But in a nation which is cynical about the Westminster party system, but even more cynical about any proposed alternatives, these are brave men and women. Not enough women, I might say, but brave men and women who put themselves at the risk of ridicule in trying to envision what a more democratic north might look like. These are the people who are seizing devolution, not as a narrow technocratic project for some short-term political advantage, but as a deeply democratic enterprise upon which all our futures are staked. And it's this devolutionary enterprise that I want to address this morning. I've titled my talk, Devolution in England, Is the Genie Really Out of the Lamp? I want to break my response into 4 parts. First, I want to look at the general case for devolution and how it's applying in England. Second, I want to explore how far this case has now been won and what we see going on in England at the present moment. Thirdly, I want to consider the obstacles for facing further devolution, or the obstacles facing further devolution in England, and the possibility that the genie might be put back in the lamp after the general election. And then finally, I want to set out some thoughts on the things that I think we need to do next. So first, the case for devolution. As I talk to people up and down the country about devolution in England, it's very clear that very few people outside of this room see devolution as an end in itself. In fact, many in this room probably won't see it in that way either. So what do we want devolution to achieve? There are three main arguments, I think, in favour of devolution. The first is to drive economic growth and address the economic imbalance that we see in England. That imbalance goes back many decades, but as many in the media are always quick to point out, the gap in productivity and prosperity between the North and the South is widening. This is in no small part, in fact it's the largest part, due to the size and the nature of our capital city. London is a one-off, a global hub, and we constantly argue at IPPR North that these crude north-south comparisons are utterly meaningless. We need to be comparing our northern economies with much more worthwhile comparators, places like North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany or the South Netherlands. But even when we make these more legitimate comparisons, it becomes clear that our northern regions, our northern economies, are lagging our European neighbours. One of the main reasons for these disparities is the relative inability of English cities and regions to control their drivers of growth. The skills systems, support for business and innovation, investment in transport, energy and housing. So many of these things are best organised around functional economic areas over larger metro regions, but their development is stifled by an over-centralised system in this country, which for over a decade has invested twice as much per person on economic development in London compared to any other region. Now there's a north-south divide. So we need devolution to set the cities and regions free to shape and grow their own economies. But we also need devolution to fix our broken public services. Now is not the time to share and rehearse the damage that's been done by successive governments who've sought to exercise top-down control in order to improve our health services, our schools and other public services. At best we can say that there has been a levelling up over time, and much of it has been done with the right intentions at the centre. But the limits to top-down public service improvement and efficiency have more recently been laid bare as round after round of cuts have brought many providers, especially local authorities, to their knees. There have been some rays of light. Total place pilots, community budgets have allowed for some limited pooling and aligning of funding at the local level, and many have recognised the clear benefits in this, but they have only been small-scale pilots, and ministers have been reluctant to give away more extensive powers. Many now advocate much more relational, joined-up, neighbourhood-based approaches to public services, particularly in addressing those most complex or acute needs. This can only be done at the local level, where professionals can work in multidisciplinary teams, cross-sector teams with pooled budgets, sharing knowledge and embracing innovation. The third strand of the general case for devolution is to do with democracy. I need to spend little time on this element because I'm going to talk a lot more about it later, but simply to say, if devolution is a means to an end, then it must connect people once again to the democratic system. Political inequality in England is rife. Voter turnouts are generally on the decline, not least amongst young people. And whether it's the Scottish nationalists north of the border or UKIP in England, the discontent with the Westminster system is plain for all to see. But so is the solution. Devolved government brings politics closer to the people. All the evidence shows that people feel that they have greatest efficacy at the local level. Pushing powers downwards reconnects people with politics and addresses the democratic deficit. So what's happening in England? If we take the general case for devolution, then my summary would be that we've grasped the case for economic devolution, we're conflicted on devolution of public services, and other than at strange meetings like this one, the debate on democratic devolution is stuck at first base. Allow me to elaborate. Even before the Scottish referendum, the case for economic devolution was already getting a fair hearing at Whitehall. Ideas about the dynamism of cities have been filtering across the pond from the likes of Ed Glaser and Saskia Sassen for well over a decade, and IPPR incubated the Centre of Cities in response. Ideas of agglomeration, new economic geography were first applied to London, but it was not a huge leap of imagination for Treasury officials and others in the past 5 years or so to see how they might apply in other cities too. The Cities Minister, Greg Clark, was quick to show how far off the pace our second-tier cities in England actually were. And so city deals were the coalition government's first attempt to redress this balance. As commentator after commentator, think tank after think tank, commission after commission has come behind this logic, the city's agenda has now fully taken hold, and we've seen further waves of government policy orientated around providing incentives and levers to promote economic growth in urban England. Regional growth funding, local enterprise partnerships, enterprise zones, local economic plans, more city deals, devolution agreements, combined authorities, all largely focused on the bigger cities. The core cities themselves must take much credit for this turnaround, consistently making the case for their size and clout of their combined economies, using good quality evidence and practical policy solutions to pave a way for political progress. Crucially though, they've organised themselves into a powerful lobby, establishing a cabinet committee with each leader having responsibility for a key portfolio, welcoming Glasgow and Cardiff into their fold and standing shoulder to shoulder with the ever-ambitious London, perhaps the only part of England to have any semblance of real city devolution through its mayor and assembly arrangements. As Monday's event in Glasgow testified, if the devolution genie is out of the lamp, it's currently found sitting at the table of the core cities cabinet, and all credit to them. But Monday's event in Glasgow wasn't all about backslapping and self-congratulation. There was an undercurrent throughout the day that the powers to unleash their economic potential were only part of the question. If the economic case for city devolution had been won, the public services case has not. Few would doubt the importance of joining up service provision at the local level, both in terms of achieving better outcomes or indeed finding financial efficiencies. But city or no city, central government departments are still a long way from giving up control over their budgets or their service responsibilities. Listening to health and DWP officials at a seminar on Wednesday on welfare devolution, I realised once again that for them, devolution is a project to be very carefully managed, avoiding risk, controlling spending, in short, not letting go. As yet, and as the cities will consistently tell us, devolution of economic powers and the devolution of public services are two sides of the same coin. Growth and public service reform, working hand in hand, is the only way to fix our fiscal crisis. In high-level terms, if Greater Manchester, who are the only ones that share these stats, spend 22 billion per annum on all the things that promote dependency and ill health, but only contribute 17 billion by doing the right things, creating jobs and raising productivity, the structural deficit is never going to heal. At a grassroots level, instead of people chasing around the system from one expensive acute service to another, from one sanction to another, why not use the resources to help find meaningful work for people, well-paid work, with a proper, affordable roof over their heads? This is the kind of switch that we have to engineer. But while the case for welfare devolution and public service reform may have been won in Scotland, it's barely out of the starting blocks in England. So let me turn for a moment to Scotland. For no account of what's going on with English devolution in the present time could fail to reference the significance of last year's independence referendum in Scotland. We have to keep reminding ourselves that the independence vote was actually lost. But a defeat for those seeking independence was still a huge victory for those wanting radical devolution. In the days running up to the referendum vote, when the Westminster parties were falling over themselves to offer ever more devolved powers, and in what has happened since through the Smith Commission and the subsequent legislation, it's surely right to say that Scotland has won concessions from London which go far beyond the things that English cities could ever dream of. Of course, there'll continue to be tussles and disagreements between Holyrood and Westminster, but by and large, Scotland will soon have the powers to determine its own future in a way only seen in some of Europe's most mature democracies, and certainly not in England. And it doesn't take a genius to see how Scotland has achieved this, through people power. There's no question in my mind that Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon are brilliant political strategists and charismatic personalities, and the SNP has had a crucial role, even in securing the referendum in the first place. But the SNP would have been all the weaker had it not been for the people of Scotland. With the promise of a referendum on the very future of the Union, democracy in Scotland came alive. Sometimes the politics was unpleasant. Much of the time, people complained that they felt deceived by politicians, not least as Treasury was so shamelessly politicised to make a case against independence. But nobody in Scotland was unmoved by the debate. I'm told of lively discussions in every church, in every pub, in every town, in every village. The future of the Union was at stake, and for once there was a genuine sense that it was entirely in the hands of the voters. And even though the end result was a close-run thing, there was one clear and resounding message that the people of Scotland cried out for all to hear. Enough of Westminster politics. We want to run things closer to home. The subsequent surge in support for the SNP has made that message all the clearer. The mainstream political party system is broken, and the only solution is devolution. Now, of course, the mainstream parties haven't heard it exactly this way, and the knee-jerk reaction has been to default to narrow party political interest. There's an important debate to be had about English parliaments and English votes for English laws, but reserving certain votes for a body of English MPs representing 55 million people is, for me, very little different from a parliament representing 60 million people, and essentially keeps the centralised Westminster system intact. To call this devolution is disingenuous indeed. Equally, though, Labour's call for a constitutional convention, plausible and important as that is, appears to do little more than to try and push the genie back into the lamp, until Labour HQ has pinned down a one-size-fits-all solution that's politically expedient to enact. Sadly, such a solution will never be found. I'm going to come back to the constitutional convention idea in a few minutes, but let's be clear. Despite Cameron's promise on the steps of Downing Street the day after the Scottish referendum had taken place, devolution in England is not proceeding in tandem with that of Scotland as anything like the scale or the scope or the pace required. Instead, it has become a political football, with big city economies top of the league and a genuine commitment to democratic renewal languishing in the relegation zone. But let's not be disillusioned. For a start, between them, the people of Scotland and the cities have kick-started a mainstream debate on English devolution. No political party will go into the next election without some kind of commitment to passing powers down to subnational levels in England. The only question is how far they will go. But perhaps more significantly than this, the mainstream debate, perhaps more significantly than the mainstream debate, is the fact that there is now a groundswell of opinion, not least in the north of England, not least in Yorkshire, which looks to Scotland with all its anger at the Westminster system and its newly found democratic vibrancy and says, we want some of that too. Having been a devolution anorak for many years now and attended many half-empty, half-hearted meetings on the subject, since the Scottish referendum, I have been amazed to find meetings packed with ordinary people suddenly wanting to talk about devolution in England, about the whys and wherefores of metro mayors, the relative merits of regional versus city regional assemblies, and whether an asymmetrical approach to devolution is a good or a bad thing. There is little consensus, and neither do we have the prospect of a Big Bang moment as they had in Scotland. But a devolutionary spirit has been stirred, and interest and attendance at today's event clearly shows that. And this devolutionary spirit is finding new political voices too. As we'll be hearing later on today, we now have two regionalist parties in the north. Yorkshire First, founded by a former Labour and former Lib Dem protagonists, secured over 19,000 votes in the European elections last year, after little more than 6 weeks of relatively low-key campaigning. Without any formal policy platform, other than its demand for an elected assembly for Yorkshire, it points towards a new type of decentralised politics. Its primary commitment is to the Bell principles, one of which is the prohibition of a party whip, meaning that party members should be free to espouse the policies that they think would work best in their own constituencies. How far such principles can go in the absence of a robust policy platform, should Yorkshire First gather growing support, remains to be seen. But it's standing candidates in 6 parliamentary constituencies in the coming general election, and I've got a feeling that even though it will fall short of winning any seats, it will certainly have an impact upon which it can then build. In the North East, meanwhile, the North East Party has been formed and has already achieved local electoral success in winning a seat on Peterlee Town Council. It too is standing for candidates for the general election and has recently launched an election manifesto which calls for an elected North East government, reformed local government and the introduction of fair property taxes. Neither Yorkshire First nor the North East Party are calling for independence from the United Kingdom, but each represent what we might call progressive local voices, which are taking on more traditional political parties, both in style and in substance. The third new political voice, which is worthy of note, is the Campaign for the North. So far, this has not found any expression as a political party, but led by Harold Ellertson, a former Conservative MP for Blackpool North, it advocates a regional government for the whole of the North, North West, North East and Yorkshire and Humber, as part of a federal Britain, and it sets out a very compelling case for the North, with clear policies on policing, health, economic development and other issues. What is interesting about these 3 new political voices in the North is that they have a number of things in common. They have a clear vision for the North of England, which is bold and confident about the future and assets that exist in the North of England. To use a favourite IPPR North phrase, they are leading and not pleading. Secondly, they play up to a sense of regional identity, something we're going to hear more about later today. But just as the Scottish appeal was to a strong sense of cultural identity, so each believes that a similar cultural identity is at the core of their own proposition and their ultimate success. And thirdly, they all seek to avoid any labelling as either left-wing or right-wing. In fact, they might all be characterised as modelling themselves against any semblance of the party machines that constitute the mainstream political system. If they're to be criticised at all, it is perhaps in their naivety, both on this point and around party organisation, but also in lacking a very clear pathway between where they stand today and how they achieve their ultimate goals. Much, of course, will depend on their relative success at the general election, but my sense is that they are indeed tapping into that same deeper disillusionment that so animated the Scottish referendum debate. And it's only a matter of time before these new political voices in the North turn a debate about economic decentralisation to the cities into a debate about democratic devolution to the north of England in its entirety. And all power to their elbows. Thirdly then, the obstacles to devolution. I want to suggest there are 4 that might cause the genie to be pushed back into the lamp. And these are the 4. The cities themselves and their newfound friends in Westminster, the attitudes of the general public, the rise of the far right, and our collective failure to act collectively. A few words about each. As someone who spent the past 5 years arguing strongly in favour of devolution to our great northern cities, you might think that it's now a bit rich for me to be holding them up as an obstacle to progress. IPPR North has consistently argued that we do need an asymmetrical approach to devolution. Different devolution deals for different places moving at different speeds. And to this extent, we remain firmly in favour of the progress that has been made and the deals that have been done. And as much as I understand the argument which is being made by some people in Greater Manchester that they should get a referendum on the Greater Manchester Mayor, I think it's ill-conceived to set ourselves up against progress by objecting to a move that will make the current cabal of Greater Manchester leaders, over whom we have no traction at all, much more accountable to their electorate. We can debate that later. Leaving this aside, though, there are 3 substantive problems with the way in which city devolution is working its way out. Firstly, asymmetry cannot mean devolution for some places and nothing for everywhere else. I, as yet, see very little thinking or planning for devolution outside of the big cities. Even in the cases of Leeds and Sheffield, the most recent devolution deals have frankly been pretty small fry. And we know that if we proceed on the current basis, there is neither the capacity in the centre or indeed in local areas to be negotiating the fine details of deals with as many as 40 or 50 different combinations of local authorities across the land. The current pattern of deal making is unsustainable and cannot be rolled out efficiently. Furthermore, we know that from London and Manchester, the real benefits of devolution are not to be found in tiny incremental steps. It may be fine to devolve one element of the skills system or one little bit of transport funding, but the real opportunities for innovation and efficiency are to be found in whole system solutions. Constrained and incremental decentralisation is a recipe for failure, and then for Whitehall officials to say, "Told you so." The so-called Manchester model may be good for some, but if we allow it to become the only game in town, then wider devolution will come unstuck. Beyond this, there's also the risk of what I'm calling cities groupthink. We've now so persuaded ourselves of the benefits of agglomeration and productivity and dense urban conurbations that we've become blinded to new data and emerging evidence which contests some of these narratives. Whilst the broad proposition that we are living in a rapidly urbanising world still holds true, and indeed that there are clear benefits for connectivity and consequent agglomeration, there is also evidence of wider trends. First, there are limits to agglomeration and particular tipping points when the benefits of size and scale are outweighed by the increased congestion and the other negative spin-offs that arise from things like rising house prices. Connectivity is much more important than sheer size. Secondly, city growth is not universally good for all city dwellers. Levels of inequality within cities can become extreme, and inequality can become more extreme than inequality between cities. And this is often due to an unrelenting pursuit of growth for growth's sake, and a hope that wealth will then trickle down to poorer neighbourhoods. The evidence suggests the absolute opposite. And thirdly, the fact is the fastest growth is now happening outside of the big cities. This has been shown in a number of recent pieces of work produced by the OECD, but it's also true when we look at more local data. Subnational productivity over the past decade, places such as Cheshire and Warrington and even Cumbria, is growing much more rapidly than places like Manchester, Leeds and Sheffield. These are not arguments against city devolution, but they are arguments that should caution us about a too narrow focus for our devolutionary plans. Quite simply, it will not be enough for devolution in England to remain satisfied with a small number of big deals in our biggest cities. And the cities themselves will need to remember that their own success will be predicated on their relationships with outlying areas, with more peripheral towns and with rural areas. Indeed, their connectivity with one another. City devolution will also become stalled if it's pursued as a technocratic exercise between government officials, local and national. I've already spelt out the risks of an undemocratic approach to devolution, but I argue that we should take care not to derail the whole project unless the perfect democratic system is found, because there is no perfect democratic system. And those that argue that the general public should be at the vanguard of any devolutionary initiative need to be careful what they wish for, because public attitudes, for me, represent the second major obstacle facing any attempt to further devolve. One of the big problems behind the English devolution debate would appear on the surface to be a lack of public appetite. Public polls tell us a number of things. They tell us that 82% of the population think that the balance between central and local government decision making is wrong. They tell us that people feel more empowered at the local level and that they trust their local councils and their councillors more than they trust Westminster and their MPs. But there are things that polls don't tell us. First, they don't tell us what kind of devolved institutions people would like to see. Apparently, we don't want mayors, we don't want regional assemblies. In fact, we don't want any more politicians at all. So what do we want? And secondly, public polls tell us that we don't want postcode lotteries. While people are prepared to accept a little bit of local variation in bin collections or transport, when it comes to schools and health services or social care, people say they want the same standards everywhere. This postcode lottery debate works on two levels. When it comes to public services, I think people are reacting to the fact that they already experience significant postcode lotteries and they don't want any more. But the evidence from around the developed world suggests that the way to avoid the lottery element of what I call postcode variation, that sense of services being left to chance and being left out of our direct control, is to allow local service providers to tailor local services to local needs. Variation, yes. Lottery, no. And I think the other fear that people have is that there'll be a postcode lottery in public finances. And again, this is something we're all too familiar with already. I can show you any number of IPPR North graphs which show huge regional disparities in the public finances, and we don't want more. But the way to deal with this is not to keep on with the same old mysterious funding formulas set out at the centre, but instead to have a more transparent and fair system where we can all see what we're getting and why. Unless or until we bring forward plans for devolution that address public concerns about precisely the form that it will take, which demonstrate the concrete improvements that it will make to locally tailored public services, and which show the people how public finances are going to be spent and not a lottery stacked against them, then the general public will remain Westminster's #1 ally. We have to win the public debate. That is, of course, unless UKIP get there first. Because the general public, I think, I've already celebrated, if you like, the new progressive political forces that are starting to find their voice in the north of England. But I think we have to accept that in terms of attracting the appeal or attracting the general public, UKIP have got there first. It was UKIP who identified this growing group of disenfranchised voters in England who are increasingly fed up with business as usual. And playing on their own concerns about immigration in Europe, UKIP have tapped into an anti-establishment sentiment in a way that more progressive parties